Many years ago, when Ann and I were first married, we lived in what could only be described as a hippie bus. It had been a bookmobile for the San Mateo County Library System in California, and we completely renovated it. It took a while, but we put in bunk beds and a bathroom and a bathtub and a kitchen with a sink and a refrigerator. We had everything. It was a lovely little home for Ann and me and our 3-year-old son. And we didn't tend to drive it much. It was kind of old and wasn't great for driving, but we would live in it. It was a home. And so in 1988, 89, Anne was in nursing school, and the bus was parked next to the house, in sort of in the side yard of a Moore Park College professor there in Moore Park, California, up on a hill, on a little terrace on the side of the hill, looking down over the town of Moore Park. Now, if you know anything about Southern California, those hills are brown. It's all dried grass and scrub and very dry, almost desert-like conditions. And we had lived there for about a year. And you know, when you live in a vehicle, you especially if you're driving fairly often, you keep cognizant of the fact that things need to be secured for the driving life. Well, we'd been living there long enough that we'd gotten kind of complacent, and so we didn't have that mindset. And one afternoon, the fire trucks with sirens screaming came up the paved road behind the house, a little higher on the hill, and firefighters came running down to the bus, and they said, "There's a wildfire coming up over the hill." And by now we could smell the smoke and see the flames just cresting the hill, just behind where we were parked. And they were saying, "You got to get this rig out of here. Once those tires catch fire, the whole thing's going to go up in flames." So after a half a second of sort of paralyzed panic, we began taking everything apart. All the dishes came down off the shelves. In fact, Anne scrambled around just taking everything off all the shelves and putting them on the floor. All the dishes, pots and pans, and cups and glasses went into the bathtub. And while she was doing that, I raced over to the house to uncouple the electricity and the water hose and get those wound up and put away. Same with the septic, disconnecting everything. And then I had to take our bed apart to get at the engine compartment, which was under the bed, so that I could get the engine prepared to be fired up. It hadn't been ignited in a while. Finally got the engine started. Everything's cleared up. We pulled the furniture and the awnings away. All that stuff's ready. We start to drive up the driveway, and the fire trucks are blocking the way out. And the firefighters, some of them are saying, "You got to get that out of here." And other ones are saying, "No, stay where you are. We'll just try to defend it as where it is." And in the midst of all this confusion, as we saw the fire coming over the hill down towards us, the wind changed direction. And the fire just burned itself out right where it was, about halfway down the slope. Well, that event was a wake-up call and a reminder to us about the fragility of our lives, and how when there's a sudden event like a wildfire approaching, sometimes we just need to unravel. We need to take apart everything that we think of as essential to our lives to prepare for this coming wildfire. We all find ourselves in a situation not too different from that now, with this wildfire pandemic, which is approaching and somewhat already here. I want to read a quote from Aisha Ahmad. She's a professor at University of Toronto, and she wrote an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education. It came out very recently. She's an expert on global disasters, natural disasters and other global events. She writes, quote, "The answer to the question everyone is asking, when will this be over, is simple and obvious, yet terribly hard to accept. The answer is never. Global catastrophes change the world, and this pandemic is very much akin to a major war. Even if we contain the COVID-19 crisis within a few months, the legacy of this pandemic will live with us for years, perhaps decades to come. It will change the way we move, build, learn, and connect." End quote. We've heard this phrase, the new normal, a lot, and I've been thinking, well, the old normal was destroying the earth. I live, and participate in an economy which efficiently maximizes turning pristine natural resources into landfill. An economy that's bad for the earth, bad for our spirits, bad for our families, a kind of insanity. So I hope that the new normal is different from and better than the old normal. We face many, many different environmental crises, most notably of which is the climate crisis. And I noticed that the climate crisis and most of these other environmental crises have something really important in common with the COVID-19 pandemic. The mathematical dynamics are very similar. We're all familiar with this idea of flattening the curve. I think many of us have mastered the concept of flattening the curve. When a pandemic is approaching and when it starts to be within our communities, there's an exponential growth in the number of people afflicted with the disease. And the whole idea of flattening the curve is that if you take the right intervention at the right time, you still have the same number of people who eventually get the disease, but you spread those cases out over time so that at no point do you cross the line that signifies the capacity of the healthcare system to take care of people. Because once you cross that line, people who might otherwise be fine with the right medical help aren't fine because they simply can't get that help. Well, hopefully, if we've done the right things here in the United States and in Pennsylvania, we've done that. We've flattened the curve so that while many of us may eventually get this disease, it won't put us beyond the capacity of our healthcare system's ability to care for us. Well, when we're talking about environmental crises, including climate change, all of those have the same kind of exponential graph, this hockey stick graph. And I know these are too small for you to make out what they are, but they include things like population growth and carbon dioxide concentration of the atmosphere and the incidence of major weather-related natural disasters and floods, the collapse of fisheries and things like that. So all these many environmental measurements have exponential growth curves, just like the ones you see here. And the same dynamic as flattening the curve applies, except that these environmental crises, especially the climate crisis, it unfolds over decades rather than days. It's really easy to see with the pandemic because from day to day we can watch those numbers go up and up and up. Well, that's also happening with climate and with other environmental crises, but the figures only come out maybe annually, or even by decades. So it's much harder to see, but it's exactly the same. So with environmental crises, the problem is that we are already well beyond the Earth's capacity to remediate the damage. The Earth does have systems for absorbing excess CO2 in the atmosphere. It can regrow forests that have been clear-cut. But when we're cutting them at a faster rate than they can regrow, that means we're already beyond that dashed red line that represents the Earth system's capacity for taking care of itself and also for taking care of us, just like the healthcare system's capacity. But there's a problem with this graph because a pandemic reaches a peak like that, but then there are fewer and fewer people who haven't yet been infected. So a pandemic disease hits a peak like that, and then it starts to come down again. But there is no peak when we're talking about environmental damage, environmental crises. We can just keep ramping it up and up and up. So this graph kind of lies if we're talking about industrial activity of people on this planet. It's really more like this. And every bit of area of that solid figure that's above the dashed red line represents death and destruction and collapsing ecosystems. I want to share a poem. It's called An Imagined Letter from COVID-19 to Humans, and it's by Kristen Flintz. And it's quite long. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm just going to read the parts that stood out the most for me. So this is a letter from the pandemic to all of us. Stop. Just stop. It is no longer a request. It is a mandate. We will help you. We will bring the supersonic high-speed merry-go-round to a halt. We will stop the planes, the trains, the schools, the malls, the meetings, the frenetic, furied rush of illusions and obligations that keep you from hearing our single and shared beating heart, the way we breathe together in unison. Our obligation is to each other, as it has always been, even though you have forgotten. We will interrupt this broadcast, the endless cacophonous broadcast of divisions and distractions, to bring you this long breaking news. We are not well. None of us, all of us are suffering. Last year, the firestorms that scorched the lungs of the earth did not give you pause, nor the typhoons in Africa, China, Japan, nor the fevered climates in Japan and India. You have not been listening. It is hard to listen when you are so busy all the time, hustling to uphold the comforts and conveniences that scaffold your lives. But the foundation is giving way, buckling under the weight of your needs and desires. We will help you. We will bring the firestorms to your body. We will bring the fever to your body. We will bring the burning, searing, and flooding to your lungs, that you might hear, we are not well. Despite what you might think or feel, we are not the enemy. We are messenger. We are ally. We are a balancing force. We are asking you to stop, to be still, to listen, to move beyond your individual concerns and consider the concerns of all. To be with your ignorance, to find your humility, to relinquish your thinking minds and travel deep into the mind of the heart. Stop. Notice if you are resisting. Notice what you are resisting. Ask why. Stop. Just stop. Be still. Listen. Ask us what we might teach you about illness and healing, about what might be required so that all may be well. We will help you if you listen. Let's do that together. Take a deep breath with me, remembering that though we are all in separate houses, the atmosphere that we breathe in and out connects us. It is a completely connected single stream of air molecules connecting all of us watching this right now. Breathe with me. All the current crises that we face now ask the same thing of us. The COVID-19 pandemic, the climate crisis, the collapse of ecosystems, extinctions, they all ask one simple thing of us. Do less. Use less. It should be so easy. COVID-19 has made it easy temporarily. We don't have any choice but to stay home and do less, to spend more time with our families, to walk in the woods and around our neighborhoods. Why is it so hard, absent a pandemic, for us to do less, to use less? Joanna Macy, in her excellent book, Active Hope, how to face the mess we're in without going crazy. She writes about 3 stories that are all being enacted, being lived within in our society today. The first story is business as usual. It's this whole idea that economic growth is what we need, is what's good, is what's important. Business as usual, as you know, is the cause of all those exponentially growing sources of damage to the Earth's natural systems. And now we are in a crisis, an epidemic, a pandemic that has completely disrupted, completely unraveled business as usual. So we get to decide, do we want to go back to business as usual or something else? Well, the second story that is being enacted in the world today, simultaneous with business as usual, is that many people all around the planet have sort of woken up to the idea that it's all falling apart, that business as usual is unsustainable. And we're reaching the point where systems, the Earth systems in particular, start to unravel. And Joanna Macy calls this the great unraveling. And that awareness is a separate story, a story of collapse, of loss, of imminent trouble, imminent collapse. But there's a third story, again, being enacted, being lived out by people simultaneous, contemporary with business as usual and the great unraveling. And that story she calls the great turning. There are some among us, maybe many of you, hopefully many of you, who are participating in business as usual because they don't have much choice. They're aware that it is all unraveling over periods of decades, but they are also making a conscious choice to turn in a great turning, she calls it the great turning, towards something different, something new, something more sustainable, something more healthy, more in balance, a little less insane than business as usual. As this pandemic approaches, it is reasonable and appropriate that we are feeling some fear. Fear for what it's going to do to our lives as we literally turn them into a shambles, the way Ann and I turned our bus into a shambles as that wildfire approached. Fear that we may catch this disease and have a really rough go of it, may even die of it. And that fear is now, a few weeks in, it's starting to give way to grief. The fear and the grief exist simultaneously. Grief for the plans we made, the hopes and dreams we had for this spring and the early summer, all of which now are being canceled. It's falling apart. It's a great unraveling of our hopes and expectations for this time in our lives. And there's also the grief that is anticipatory grief that people we love and care about may be taken by this pandemic disease as it sweeps through like a wildfire. And as the weeks wear on, I'm becoming increasingly aware that after the fear and the grief will come something else, a new normal. It would be nice if the new normal were something simpler, something better, something more sustainable, something more consciously connective. My daughter is a seminary classmate of Reverend Terry's, and this year she's working as a palliative care chaplain at a hospital in New York City. I don't know if you know that a palliative care chaplain is someone who literally holds people's hands as they are dying and is present with them as they make their transition. Well, my daughter was explaining this to someone, and they said, "How do you stay positive?" And she said, "I don't. I stay connected." One of the opportunities that this time out, this pause in our crazy lives that the coronavirus offers us is a chance to be more connected. I know we can't be physically connected with the people we want to be with, but it's a pause, it's a time out to think about the ways that connection are important, not just to the people we love and care about and work with, but also our connection with the earth, our connection to one another, and our connection to people far away, people and systems and ecosystems far away. This pandemic has made it crystal clear to me, and I hope to others as well, that what happens in some small, obscure city in central China is intimately connected with what happens to me here in central Pennsylvania. There are some seeds. Eucalyptus is one, and lodgepole pine is another, and there are others. There are seeds that can only germinate in fire. They require forest fires or brush fires in order to create the next generation. Let us take this pause in our crazy lives to become the change we wish to see in the world, to use this time to reflect on what kind of world do we want the new normal to be, and to turn, to participate in the great turning towards that in whatever way you are uniquely qualified to do that. I wanted to show you some pictures of our bus. I did tell you it was a hippie bus, right? We loved that bus. We built it. It was our family home. Our daughter was born in it. When we moved to Ohio, we bought some land that had a barn big enough to park the bus inside. We were going to build our house around the bus because we couldn't even imagine life without it. Then one winter the heater broke and we had to move, temporarily mind you, into the one room that was finished. We never moved back into the bus. Still, it was years before we let it go. Letting go of old familiar ways is really hard. Sometimes it takes a broken heater or a deadly disease. Let us begin the process of letting go of all that dry underbrush that complicates and hinders our lives. Let us be the seeds that germinate in fire and create a whole new forest that's fresher, cleaner, simpler, and more spiritually rewarding. Amen. May it be so.